Okay, so maybe we should start now. And I'm going to speak a little bit at the beginning, which is hopefully the last time I'll make a sort of long monologue before I'm going to ask our panelists to do most of the talking. So, okay, welcome to the graduate program in International Affairs at the New School. My name is Sean Jacobs. I'm an assistant professor in this program, and I teach in the media concentration that's organizing this panel today. If you want to learn more about the program, see our website, gpia.info, or via the New School's website, newschool.edu. Today's program is entitled Africa's World Cup and revolves around next month's football festival in South Africa. And as we say in the program, it is of course also more than that, more than just a football festival. We've assembled a great panel to talk about the issues around the World Cup, especially its historic significance. But first, I wanted to do a few plugs. I see Binyavanga's magazine, Kwani, and some other work that he's bringing from BARD. That I think you're going to hand that out at some point to people who are interested. Secondly, there's a plug for Context magazine, which is a magazine produced by our students, which will be out next week or so. There's a flyer that's around here if you want to grab one of those. Thirdly, watch out for notices of our monthly event series in the fall and the winter of 2011, this is the last in the series of events that was held this semester. The first one was with Gary Young and Ian Baruma, both journalists, writers. The second was with James Hogue, who's the editor of Foreign Affairs, and this is the final one for this semester on the World Cup. Finally, outside the New School, for those who are here in June, there are two film festivals focusing on football or soccer in the lineup to the World Cup. These are the first. It's called Kicking and Screaming Soccer Film Festival. It's scheduled for June 1 to 5, June the 1st or the 5th, at Tribeca Cinemas. And you can find out about this film festival at kickingandscreaming.com. That program, by the way, includes the film The Game of Their Lives, which is a film about the North Korean team that went to the 1966 World Cup in England and went as far as the quarterfinals, where they were beaten by Portugal, which starred, of course, the great African player, or as Portugal would say, the great Portuguese player, Eusebio. Around the same time, from June the 2nd till the 8th, BAM will have a program of football films. They have particularly the 1970 film, which is called Football as Never Before. I'm not going to say the German title because I'm going to mangle it, which is a real-time portrait of the Northern Ireland player George Best, following him for 90 minutes. It's debatable how many cameras were used, I think 3 or 4. And then, of course, most of us know about the film called Zidane, a 21st century portrait, which is the kind of remake of the original film. The original film is not seen that much, so I would encourage people to go see this film if you're around. Both festivals also have some films about focusing on the fact that this is the first World Cup held in Africa. Kicking and Screaming has a film called Africa 10, which is a little bit more uplifting. And then BAM has 2 films between the Cup and the election, which I've seen at the African Film Festival. It's an excellent film about the 1974 Zaire team that went to the World Cup in West Germany. And then the second film, which is called Fahrenheit 2010, which is a sort of very pessimistic take on the politics around the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. So to our panel then, but before I say something about, there's one other plug. There's a plug for our concentration, the media concentration. Thanks, Adam. We have a concentration meeting for any students that are interested next Wednesday from 6 till 8. The room, I think, is on the 7th floor, 704. We're going to have a concentration meeting. Some of our students will show some of their work, short films, photography, etc. And some professors will come around and talk about their courses if you're interested in coming out to that. So before I say something about who our panelists are, just for those who don't know much about Africa's place in the World Cup, I was online today thinking I need to just quickly, have a couple of jumbled notes about Africa's place in the World Cup. And the first World Cup, as you know, was played in 1930 in Uruguay. And there were only 13 teams that participated, and there was no African participant. Of course, that's not surprising. Most African countries were colonies. with the exception of some African countries that were sort of self-governing, like Egypt and others. So Egypt was the first African country to participate in the World Cup. That was in the next World Cup, That was held in 1934. At the following World Cup in 1938, this is the World Cup before the Second World War, because the World Cup then gets suspended for about 12 years. No African teams were included in that World Cup. Also, interestingly, the Dutch East Indies, which I think was Indonesia, played in that World Cup, but they did very badly. So no World Cups played until 1950, when it was hosted by Italy. Sadly, no African team played in that World Cup. No African team played in 1954 or 1958 or 1962. Right after 1962, the Africans were now independent, had formed their own football union called CAF. And they made a deputation or a protest to FIFA saying, look, we need an automatic place like all the other continents, South America, at that time also North America. America was also in the beginnings of the World Cup. America participated. Europe, of course. And they were given one place. They didn't play in the 1966 World Cup. Of course, as I've mentioned already, Eusebio was there from Mozambique, but playing for Angola. And of course, France always had players from Algeria and Morocco and so on. So in the 1970 World Cup, Morocco got the spot. They did very badly, of course. They finished last in their group, but they did draw with Belgium. In 1974, of course, Zaire played. They allowed 14 goals, so that looked really bad. For Africa, in 1978, Tunisia represented the continent. We now had one place. But in 1982, this was a crucial World Cup. A lot of people talk about 1990 and Cameroon's performance as sort of beginning this kind of golden age, not so much a golden age, but making the world realize that perhaps, Africans can win the World Cup. In 1982, two teams went to the finals, Cameroon and Algeria. To make a long story short, Cameroon drew all their games, and they finished with the same amount of points as Italy. And Italy only went through on goal difference in their group, so that's the second team in their group. And also they were denied, while playing against Peru, as you can see, I'm heard about this, they were denied against Peru when they scored a goal, but the referee disallowed it, and most of the people who have seen the video of it says that actually they scored a goal. As for Algeria, they had a worse deal. They played in a group with Austria and Germany. They beat Germany in the first game, and Chile was the other team. They beat Chile, but they lost to Austria. When it came down to the final match, at this point, the final group match wasn't played on the same day. And so Algeria had played their game, and the next day Germany played Austria. Germany had to win by 1 goal. And most people, there's a debate about this as to whether Germany and Austria conspired, and Uwe is laughing, to keep an Anschluss, to keep Algeria out of the next round. Okay, to make a long story short, 1986, a forgettable World Cup, except that it's interesting for Morocco making it to the second round, which is the first time an African team make it to the second round. And then comes this great World Cup, right, of 1990, Cameroon and Egypt qualifying. I remember this World Cup because I have to get the facts straight about this, but I think that was the first World Cup when I was living in South Africa at the time that was shown live in South Africa on South African TV. 86. Nelson Mandela. 86 was the first, I heard.
Only the last 4 games.
Only the last 4 games, but the whole World Cup in 1990 was shown on the World Cup. Sorry, on television, live on TV, and I remember this, rooting for Cameroon. Cameroon beating Argentina in the first game, going on to the quarterfinals, where they lost to 2 very unfortunate penalties during the course of the match against England. After that, things weren't that great. 1998, South Africa played in their first World Cup, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a long road that Africa has traveled with the World Cup. So with that context then, let me introduce quickly our panelists, and then we'll just show you a couple of quick, short 2 or 3 ads which I've asked the panelists to look at. And then right after that, I'd like the panelists to comment on these images of the World Cup, and perhaps just to open the discussion, talk about what they think this World Cup in Africa means at this particular point. So let me say something about the panelists. We have 2 panelists who actually support Liverpool Football Club, who are proud to say at this point still that they support Liverpool. So I'm going to start with them. Okay. So our first panelist on the extreme end is Tony Caron, who's a senior editor at Time. He says time.com because they're trying to make the transition to the electronic age, where he writes analyses on the Middle East and other conflicts. He also writes on geopolitics and football for his own site, Ruthless Cosmopolitan, as well as for The National in Abu Dhabi and the Sunday Times in South Africa. And I'm going to quote him here. He has been a Liverpool fan since the 1970s, but he doesn't want to talk about that right now. Then there's, right next to me, Teju Cole, who's a Brooklyn-based writer and photographer. His first book, Every Day is for the Thief, a novella of Lagos, was published by Cassava Republic Press in 2007. His novel, Open City, set in New York City, will be published by Random House next spring. Mr. Cole has written about a wide range of subjects for the Nigerian newspaper Next. I would actually encourage people to check out that newspaper online, Next. And he's currently at work on another work of fiction about contemporary Lagos. Quickly about Liverpool Football Club and Mr. Cole. He says in his own words, this has been a painful year. So then we have Austin Merrill, who's an editor at Vanity Fair, where he also manages Fair Play, the magazine's World Cup blog. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in the mid-1990s in the Ivory Coast, and between 2002 and 2003, he was based in Abidjan for the Associated Press, covering the Ivorian Civil War and politics and culture across West Africa. His writings on Africa has appeared in Wired, The New Republic, The New York Observer, Tin House, Good, and elsewhere, and I don't think he's a Liverpool supporter. No. He's not. Okay. Finally, there's Binyavanga Wainana. He's a writer of fiction, essays, and memoirs. He received the 2002 Kane Prize for African Writing, Africa's most prestigious literary award. And his honors include a Lannan Foundation Fellowship, Chevening Scholarship. He's like, stop with the scholarships. And he has also published widely. He's actually, the thing about him, and I think he's probably like, he doesn't want to talk about it. Do you still want to live down the how to write about Africa, which is a very satirical essay that he wrote for Granta and that got published elsewhere. And then finally, he's currently, this is his day job, he's director of Bard College's Chinua Achebe Center for African Languages and Literature. So after that very long kind of intro, just to get things going, I send a number of video clips to the panelists, some which we'll show you quickly, just to give people a sense of the kind of media and advertising images circulating about the World Cup. The first one we'll show, and students of mine, of my classes, we've seen these videos before, so they're not going to be surprised, is Puma has an ad called Love Equals Football, which you don't show them yet, which is part of their 2010 campaign. Puma has been big on this World Cup, including commissioning the artist Kendo Wiley to do a series of paintings in his style, as well as designing clothes and shoes around the World Cup. Puma, as you know, sponsors the other 5 African qualifiers, not South Africa, which is sponsored by Adidas. And South Africa, of course, did not have to qualify for this tournament. The second commercial we're going to show is for the official South African tourism body, and they made a commercial around what is called a dance called Diski. This is both a kind of a dance, and it's also a style of football which has not brought South Africa very good results. But it's supposed to encompass reflect the rhythm of South Africa and South African culture. Finally, we'll show a clip of the first 2 minutes of a trailer of the academic and filmmaker Jesse Shipley's film on Ghana's road to the World Cup, which is called Black Star. And then right after that, I'm not going to, again speak, but I'll just end one of our panelists to having seen, these images and ideas floating around the World Cup, just about their thought and images about these images, but just in general as to what they think this World Cup means. So let's show the images quickly, and then we'll go straight to their comments.
Okay, I wanted to play for Blaster because my dream is I want to raise my Ghana flag high.
Every player's ambition is to play outside, to play in the biggest team outside. I'm waiting, and I hope God's time is always the best.
What be your hustle? Hey, what be your name? See what you do with your muscles. Keeping up with your painting. Man can't eat, so be like all be the same team. What are you, lawyer, doctor, or you the bullshit for energy?
Football is a passion of the people. No matter what age of people are playing, it's not something about the national team. Whether it's first division, third division, people would go there. Men, women, children alike.
We love football in this community. If somebody doesn't even have television, the time is up to play. Even if the time is 2 o'clock at dawn, you see them sitting in front of at the streets watching.
Just watch a finals. If it's between Brazil and say Germany, you see the whole world will be split into two.
Yeah, my friend, come and see. This is the Muntali.
Every day some brand new plans. Gotta maneuver my way to the top with some real hip hop and still try and make it dance.
We all know that Ghana's first appearance at the World Cup was at the 2006. Before then, so much noise was made about Cameroon's appearance at the 1990 World Cup. You're talking about Cameroon, but wait till Ghana gets on the scene.
Okay, maybe we should, so, do you want to switch the light on again before we start? You got it? Okay, so I'm going to shut up now. Panelists. Who wants to go first? Now they sit up. I should move the mic to you.
It makes me feel homesick. I'm leaving next week to go back home, and then I'm going to be in Accra. So that's what I'm thinking. The Puma one was unsurprising in a certain way, right? The whole idea, because this is kind of, even with the Creative Arts Network, this kind of idea of the phone hasn't arrived yet. You know, there's no, the phone is waiting to come, and Africa is this pure, beautiful place. Is the Puma thing is visible there, but they make it look gorgeous, and I kind of felt, it felt good. I also did like, so that was one thing. I did like, the thing about it is, the going back to the 70s for me, in a way, where soccer was on national radio, national television, and on these broadcasts, and we used to broadcast them themselves, and with very little commercial breaks and interruptions in a side. And so the language then of the guys commentating were very much about, not so much about who's scoring, but who's playing, what the play is, and the visuals of the play, kind of really familiar. And so I liked that they kind of got a little bit of the flavor of that. The South African Tourist Board one was, I think, also very clever. I like the fact that they set it up in a school. I like the idea of the school kid in there, and even around the Duka idea, there was also a very clear idea. You can see that South Africa is ready for investment. South Africa is, it was there, but very kind of subtle. Look, it's all arranged in right parts and as should be. But it was entertaining, and I enjoyed it. What else did I feel I noted in the second one? Then what was the third one we watched?
Just a little clip from the documentary.
I love Black Stars, and I hope they win the World Cup.
We can come back to you again.
This is a little bit of a segue because I have a prepared statement.
This is what the World Cup does to people.
The World Cup is not being hosted by Africa, but by a country in southern Africa, the Republic of South Africa. Nigeria is not hosting this year's World Cup, but late last year it hosted FIFA's Under-17 World Cup. I watched the Under-17 matches in Lagos with my family. Enthusiasm was slow in building, but once Nigeria progressed in the tournament, People got into it, and you began to see clusters of young men around television sets in cafes and canteens. The tournament itself was not disastrously organized. Of course, much of the money earmarked for the tournament was stolen by the local organizing committee and members of the government. But matches took place, reasonably officiated. Teams in air-conditioned buses beat Lagos traffic and made it to their matches on time. And no Uruguayan or Spaniard fell victim to an elaborate advance fee scam. As they say, count your blessings. But this matter of scams, Nigerian enthusiasm was tepid for one specific reason. Many of us knew that our players were overage. In fact, just days before the tournament, half of the Golden Eaglets team was dropped when MRI imaging found that they were well over 17 years old. But the suspicion remained, strengthened by the evidence of our eyes, that the remainder were also men, not boys. Around the time that the Nigerian team was pummeling Spain in the semifinals, around the time that local fervor was reaching its highest pitch, a former Super Eagles player, Amir Simaka, came out with the news that a Golden Eaglet, Chukwudi Uche, was, quote, at least 25 years old. A quote, "One of my key players then is the current captain of our so-called under-17 Golden Eaglets. By his own admission at that time, that is 7 years ago, he was 18 years old." End quote. The amazing thing is that Amir Simaka was either ignored or insulted, and the tournament went on. In the final, a very boyish Swiss side defeated the mannish Golden Eaglets 1-0 to win the tournament. By a strange twist of fate, just 2 days before the under-17 final, the Super Eagles, after a mediocre campaign, defeated Kenya, 3-2 in Nairobi. Combined with Tunisia's freakish loss in Maputo, the Eagles, after we had given up hope, booked passage to South Africa. But there's a mood over Nigerian football, and I couldn't help but notice the restraint in the celebrations that followed qualification. We don't have the players we used to have, and we don't have the team we used to have. The team contains only one truly world-class player, Chelsea's John Obi Mikel. Part of the problem is that so many of our stars lie about their ages, 32-year-olds in 22-year-olds' clothing, brilliant in youth tournaments and fatigued on the biggest stage. My father said, while we were watching the under-17 final, "The person who steals chickens at night and the one who steals it during the day have one thing in common. They both use the same woven basket." Well, what does that mean, Dad? Nigeria, our age cheats, my father said, but the Swiss, famous for some of the harshest immigration restrictions in the world, have been generous in giving citizenships to Brazilian, Turkish, Ghanaian, and Croatian boys. It's a scam with documents. The Nigerian one is undocumented. So, who's the real cheat?
It's interesting, the comment that you opened with about the tournament is being held in a country called South Africa, not on the entire continent. And you have a blog called Africa is a Country. Is that right? You hear a lot of talk about Africa's not a country, especially when our previous president was in office, trying to make sure people didn't have those kinds of slip-ups. And yet something I thought was interesting that I read recently, Kanan, the Somali Minnesotan rapper, has this wonderful song, Wavin' Flag, that has been sort of redone and repackaged for Coca-Cola for the tournament. And he did a trip across the continent over the last several months and stopped in, I think, 30 countries or something crazy, and had all of these various concerts. And I spoke to his representatives recently and was told that one of the most amazing things that they found was that it really did feel like Africa was a country, one country. And these were not Coca-Cola representatives along for the ride who were saying this. These were the Africans they were encountering along the way. There really is this sense that this tournament is for the entirety of the continent and not just for one place. The Puma ad, I think, speaks to that. You've got all of these, you have this sense that it's, you know, it's all of Africa that's hosting this. And, you know, I don't know what we're going to end up taking from that here in the States, those of us who watch. Thank God we live in New York. In the for the 06 tournament, I was caught in Charlotte for a wedding. And was flying home the day of the finals.
Let's hope that couple, they don't watch this YouTube video.
I was flying home the day of the final, the Italy-France final, and in the couple of airports I had to stop in along the way, I couldn't see any of the game that was going on because I think it was the day of the NFL draft or something, and that's what everybody was showing. And I arrived home just in time to sprint to the television and see Zidane headbutt Materazzi. And anyway, thankfully we live in New York. You know, I don't know what that all means as far as, you know, Africa as a country, Africa as a continent of many countries, but there is certainly something to be said for what it's doing all over the continent and how people are following it everywhere. I was in Angola for the last week of the Cup of Nations in January, and it was phenomenal how many people there were looking forward to South Africa, almost looking past the tournament that was being hosted there on their soil, waiting for South Africa to be in. So it's going to be exciting.
Actually, it would have been interesting. There were two things. I don't know if people saw the Pepsi ad that we're showing when you walked into the room, because I think in some ways that whole Lion King thing, you know, in comparison to the Puma one, I actually like the Puma ad because I actually think Africa is neither a continent or a country. In some ways, it's a relationship rather than a thing. It's a relationship between the West and you know, a certain group of countries, a certain group of people from those countries, and it exists in a much more dynamic way, in a way that ad captures in the very fact that it had the Gnarls Barkley soundtrack. Because if you go to all the other, by the way, Africa football ads have very traditional, sort of, you know, some French pop producer's idea of African music. If you go into an African city anywhere in Africa today, the soundtrack you're going to hear is hip hop. Because the world doesn't exist in these kind of sealed off places. It exists in a kind of relationship. And there are many things we could talk about. There was a clip that actually I would have loved, for me, things that capture the essence of, you know, football in Africa, which that Puma thing I think did pretty well. There's a clip you can get on YouTube, which is a trailer for a Nigerian gangster movie, like a real exploitation one called Liverpool versus Chelsea. And there are these two rival gangs running around in Liverpool and Chelsea strips and kind of watching games on TV and fighting it out and so on. It's, you know, it's trashy, but it's funny. But it speaks to, you know, a real condition in African cities all over the continent where what are we watching? We're watching the European Champions League. We're watching the English Premiership. The global audience for the European game now is so massive that the whole quality of the World Cup has changed entirely. So, I mean, just to throw out an example of something that I think is worth thinking about for this World Cup. Pelé in Brazil, 1958, Pelé explodes onto the international scene. There's the 17-year-old black kid from Brazil who can do things with a ball that nobody's ever seen before, and everybody's just blown away. And Pelé, the name Pelé becomes a household name to people who know nothing about the game, but it becomes the standard of excellence. And what's kind of remarkable about Pelé is that the world only actually sees him at 4-year intervals between 1958 and 1970, and that's it. He plays his club football in Sao Paulo for Santos, and you know, that's it. And then he retires here. I mean, when he comes to the New York Cosmos, it's retirement. That's not serious anymore. So, you know, you contrast that to okay, but Pelé at the same time, and the Brazilians are the icon of the global South in football. Bob Marley talks about himself as being a Brazilian, identifies himself with Brazil when it comes to football, because they are they're the African diaspora in the game, and in the global relationship between Africa and the West, if we're going to use those terms. Today, interestingly, there's no single champion of the global South in that way, because the global South, or people who represent it, are much more present. So you'll have figures like Didier Drogba on the cover of Vanity Fair and Time magazine this week, expressing that idea. Hero, sort of African football heroes with whom the global South is going to get behind. Interesting thought, though, I think, is that Pele stayed in Sao Paulo his whole playing career. Today's African football heroes are all migrants. They're all based in Europe. The guys in that Puma ad shot the ad back home, but Emmanuel Eboe lives in London. Who else is in that ad? Samuel Eto'o lives in Milan. No, yeah, Milan. Right, and the third one was John Mensah, Fulham, also lives in London, and. The reality of Côte d'Ivoire is going to take a team to the World Cup that might have one home-based player, one of the reserve keepers. Ghana, the same. One of the reserve keepers is based in Ghana. Everybody else is playing in Europe. It's an interesting sort of nexus as well between the corporate and the national, because like that video, Chelsea versus Liverpool video, people are more. We all watch those players every week. We watch the same group of players week in, week out. And people, you'll see photographs of a Sadrist demonstration in Baghdad and somebody's wearing an Arsenal Thierry Henry shirt. Mm-hmm. And you'll see a picture of the Shabab gunman in Mogadishu and somebody's wearing a Thierry Henry Arsenal shirt. And that same shirt maybe is being sold in a mall in San Diego or in Shanghai. Mm-hmm. So there's there's commerce going on. Somebody's making billions of dollars of selling these replicas. But there's also some sort of representational politics going on. People are identifying with those shirts for reasons which, I guess we can discuss at length, but I'll leave it there for now.
Can I just ask you, are you sort of depressed by that, or do you think this is all...
No.
Or do you want to see where it's going?
No, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think it's a terrain. But it's not, this whole idea that it's Africa's World Cup, it's like, well, actually the European Champions League belongs to Africa in some way. The English Premiership belongs to Africa in some way, not only in the fact that its players are there, but African people all over the continent are watching those games week in, week out. We're all, I'm from South Africa as well, like Sean. We've all sort of identified with a British team somewhere, for decades, and it's somehow part of our identity in some strange fetishistic sort of way. But yeah, I mean, I think it's much more, it's not, I don't find it depressing. I think it's much more dynamic and interesting.
Do you want to add something?
I'm a lapsed Liverpool fan.
I should also confess that I'm also a Liverpool fan. It wasn't planned this way.
Same thing when you're a kid, those black and white TV days. And I must say, I hated football. I hated everything about football. I hated the fact that everyone knew how to play it and I didn't, that everyone wanted to play it and I didn't. And then my brother and my dad would sit and they had to watch these 1.5-hour matches. And so it was just the default position was Liverpool, and then I'd fall asleep and then say, who won? So these days, I'm like, I hate anyone who beats Man United because I still don't want my brother's team to win. But I'm not interested enough in. But the World Cup is something else. I mean, and the African Nations Cup for a long time, even though now it's kind of lost a bit of its. The last two haven't had a thing. I guess for me, how we at the center have been trying to think for a year about what to do for this World Cup. I felt that at first, of course, we are writers, so we always have very stingy, unimpressed things to say and be like, it's all commercial, it's terrible, and then. But then, we are soccer watchers. So anyway, we decided to put together some kind of thing. Initially, in fact, we had banned South Africa from being in not the cities, to be one of the cities, because we were like, everybody's going to be in South Africa. Why not, while everyone else is in South Africa, why not send 12 writers to other cities in Africa to be watching down? But then still Joburg, Cape Town. Anyway, so we decided to send 12 writers to 12 cities. In Africa for 2 weeks during the last 2 weeks of the World Cup. We tried to pick up some of the most exciting, different, diverse. Writers be writing in French, writers writing in English. Many complicated diasporas in the usual way. here and there, home and away that's home, like the cup, and their job is not really to write about soccer. I mean, we just thought, you don't need to put soccer in the itinerary because, like, it doesn't matter where you're going to be going. It's going to be happening, right? So each person has a different itinerary. So we have Dakar, Lagos, Cape Town, Joburg, Hargeisa, Nairobi, Abidjan, Touba in Senegal, Timbuktu, Luanda, Angola, Cairo. And sometimes you'll be going to follow the history of a song, as in the case with Yvonne, we'll be following a Franco song in Kinshasa, and then a group of artists in Kinshasa will make an itinerary for her to follow a Franco song. Because I think Franco could well be as big as soccer in Africa, just him alone.
Yes.
Franco is a Congolese musician who died. And that's the idea. So, and the premise basically was like, cynically, one, I'm likely to get money for it. Like, no other time, anywhere, will I tell people, I want to send people across the continent, and they're like, but why? Why would you want to do it? If I say maybe anti-poverty, if I maybe say AIDS, I might, but that's it. But now, people are like, there's an Africa, right? Everyone is like, there's an Africa because of the World Cup. So cynically, it's possible, but also, it's actually not cynical that there is that moment that we are habituated to watching. There's not a single person who is an African, especially that Cameroon match. Those two Cameroon matches in 1990, who wasn't like, you are all in the same mood on the same day at the same time, and da-da-da-da. And nothing like that had ever happened since Mandela, maybe. And then before that,
Lady Diana.
The death of Lady Diana. Yeah, there wasn't anything that had a thing like that. And also a kind of history of attentiveness to local matches, people in Man United. So it's a time you're like, where are you from, my brother? In New York, and you're like, oh, Ivory Coast. And the other time, it's more, maybe you don't care, maybe you do, and so on and so forth. So it just felt like a great thing. And two, one of the things that was kind of depressing about that process, I mean, I'm very excited about that process was that, really feeling that it was only that could give me the legitimate feeling of passion to say, I'm going to go and hawk this idea for 7 months and plead and beg. Because we've been talking about doing some kind of Pan-African literacy project with people for a long time. And then, you have a discussion, you write notes, then you go and sleep in the morning. It's not there. This one had legs. And you kind of feel like I should be doing it for Kwame Nkrumah or somebody, but it's for Drogba. That's...
But on the continental level, you shouldn't be too depressed because as far as I can tell, the only thing holding the nation of Nigeria together right now is a football team. There's really no other profound basis for feeling that we're all Nigerians. I was observing very closely, traveling in different parts of the country. I don't think people really have that national identity, really. So football, even as depressing as it is right now in Nigeria, remains a very important hook to put this idea that we're a nation on. But I want to think about this, we're all Africans thing, because, now it's, now the whole world wants to say we're all Africans, and no, you're not. 4 years ago, you weren't all German, It's,
there's going to be a lot of love flying around.
So it's a lot of love, and, I'm very skeptical of love. We have an unfortunate convergence now of the joyous, festive thing that football is, with one of the convenient narratives of what Africa is or should represent, which is a continent full of happy morons. We are poor, but we're joyful, and so the Puma ad, I actually think it's a beautiful piece of filmmaking. You should go home and watch it again. It's done very, very well, but it functions within a larger framework. And you need to see the ads that are much worse than it is, but done with just as big a budget, like the ones by Pepsi, the one by Coca-Cola. They are really tragically tone deaf to what it means to try to tell stories about other people. And that is the framework here. We're entering a very intense period of people trying to tell stories about Africa. We're entering a period of frantic essentialism, for the people who are doing the narrating, a kind of defensible essentialism, because they'll say, oh, we're just showing that you're happy and that we're celebrating with you. But it is this kind of very narrow storytelling that excludes anything that does not function within that story. So, for example, Lagos, Nigeria, is almost entirely absent from almost every single one of those promotional World Cup things by the big corporations. And I think there might be any number of reasons, but part of it is that Lagos, Nigeria, becomes a kind of space that is hard to shoehorn into the, into the dusty safari. I mean, there are definitely slums in Lagos, but you would have to be as wrong-headed as the BBC to show a Lagos that does not show also very strong signs of modernity and everyday life that looks like everyday life here. So that is, I mean, I don't know what you guys have to say about that, but I think that is one of the most profound problems that anybody who's interested as an African in what's going on in this World Cup is going to have to face.
Well, one thing that I'm noticing very flatly right now is that I'm the only non-African sitting up here, so I feel that very poignantly right now.
That's a good thing. It's okay.
Will be nice.
But you're talking about these narrative storylines, and I feel like I sort of have to pick up on the one that I have the most experience with. And, the story of the Ivorian team and what Drogba has done with the Ivorian team and the civil war in Ivory Coast is sort of known by everyone, and Bono's done a lot of, sort of publicity around that and so forth. But it's really quite a remarkable thing. I feel like in many ways it's impossible to get across what he means to that country and what he has meant to Ivory Coast. And so I just want to tell a little story, even though this is sort of almost hackneyed by now, and this narrative has been told 1,000 times. But I was there, and it's a remarkable sort of example of what football can do for people anywhere, but in this particular case in Ivory Coast. In June of 2007, it was a nondescript game. It was Ivory Coast versus Madagascar, and it was a qualifier match for the Cup of Nations. And Drogba had just won the Footballer of the Year award. And he went to Abidjan and then he went to Bouaké, which is the rebel capital, and proposed that the game be held in Bouaké instead of in Abidjan. And nothing, the front lines were still up, the country was still divided north-south. There hadn't been any fighting in any long time, but it was a very divided place. And this was a radical idea. And the president and the rebel leader, who's now the prime minister, everyone was sort of taken aback by this notion. No one had the idea. It took him to have this idea. And they all approved it, and they decided to have this match in Bouaké. I actually flew up to Bouaké with the prime minister, the rebel leader, who by then was the prime minister, and still the rebel leader. It's complicated. And got there for the game, and it was just an incredible thing. They had, the stadium was packed, the town did everything they could to get ready for the match. It was the first time the front lines had come down. It was a blowout, it was 5-0, but the fifth goal was Drogba's goal. It was 4-0 until something like the 85th minute. And Drogba scored, and he said later that it was very important to him that he scored that goal for this peace match of a sort. And after the game, when everyone was celebrating and I was trying to talk to some fans and some players and such, lots of people told me the same thing. They said the score was 1-0. And I kept on saying, well, but the score was 5-0. And they said, no. The only goal that meant anything to them was the last one, was Drogba's goal. The man there is really, I mean, to call him a god is understating it. He just absolutely walks on water. And you know, what you were saying earlier about growing up in Africa and sort of following these teams in England and in Europe and so forth, they all have followed him from afar. He hasn't lived in Ivory Coast since he was 5 years old. Yeah. But it's an incredible narrative, and you know, a few days later, I was back in Abidjan with the team, trying to get an interview with him. I'll try to keep this short, but trying to get an interview with him. I was following him down the hallway of the hotel. And he had promised me a few minutes of his time, and didn't know what to do because it was hard. I was flying out the next day back to New York. I went out in front of the hotel, and his Porsche was sitting there. He had his Porsche shipped down from London so that he could drive his own car while he was in Abidjan. And so I was with a French journalist who was a friend of mine, and we just looked at each other and shrugged and just opened the door of the Porsche, and we got in. And so we were sitting in the back seat of his Porsche, and he was on the cell phone. He came out of the hotel and sat in the front seat and turned around and looked at us and said, "You ready?" I didn't even know what we were doing. And he took off and drove through Abidjan. The traffic was terrible, but he found his way against traffic to get to the airport. We got on the president's plane that he'd given us. There were 9 of us. And we flew to his parents' hometown, about an hour flight. And just by chance, I just happened to sort of, you know, force my way into this. No one knew he was coming. We landed, we had an hour drive once we got there in these, you know, armored Mercedes limo ride. And the villages just emptied out. Word skipped ahead of us and traveled, and the streets clogged with people. We couldn't get through these villages. People were crying, fainting. It was an absolutely incredible thing. I wrote a story about it for the website at Vanity Fair, and I've always felt like it was an impossible thing to get across, and it's impossible to get across now. It's a story that's been told, I think, by now by a lot of people, but it's an incredible narrative, and it's just an incredible example of what this game, and in this case, this person, has done for a lot of people.
I mean, one of the one further example to that is that in the past decade or so, the dominant musical style, dance music style in all of Francophone West Africa and almost in all of West Africa has been the coupé décalé. And a very significant offshoot of that has been the style known as Drogba Cité, which is based on Drogba. It's just, there have been all these records, all these #1 hits that are in the Drogba Cité style. And it does not remain in Abidjan, in Côte d'Ivoire. It spreads all over, even to English-speaking countries like Nigeria. So he really is a godlike figure. But I wanted to follow up on something that Tony was talking about earlier, which is the very profound sophistication of the African football fan. I mean, part of the reason you worry about outsiders going in there and trying to tell a story, a predetermined story. They want to, I don't know, they want to go out into the Serengeti and have villagers celebrating football or whatever story they have in their mind, is that it so often misses the real truth of what's happening on the ground, which is the sophistication of the African football fan. It's much easier to follow the English league, the Spanish league, the best football in the world. It's easier to follow it, from my experience, easier to follow it in Nigeria than it is to follow it in the UK, far easier than it is to follow it in the US. But even in the UK, because of broadcasting restrictions and rights and all this stuff, you end up watching Match of the Day, which is like, you know, a summary show. In Nigeria, with basic cable, you're watching football every night of the week. They know who the players are. They know what's going on. They're deeply invested in it, to the extent that the local league is completely withered. It does not matter. It doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore. You could say that's a little bit sad, but it also means that people are in the position of making their own choices about what they care about. And so the Champions League final becomes a very profoundly personal thing to most football viewers in Nigeria. You know, you have chairs set up in front of restaurants and things like that. Bets are taken. Afterwards, there are riots. A few boys die, but everybody has to die sometime. You know, people bleed. I mean, it becomes like a field of self-testing and self-actualization. When a Nigerian bus driver tells you, we defeated Manchester United, and by we, he means Chelsea Football Club. I mean, there are many ways of understanding that, but one fundamental way of understanding it is to understand that it really means something. It's a real statement. He is we, because he lives and breathes Chelsea. And I'm sorry that those kinds of stories are going to be missing this summer, because that is the story of football in Africa.
Can I just make a slight correction before Tony speaks? The Puma and Nigeria, I think, is sponsored by. Aren't they sponsored by Nike? Is they also by
Is it Adidas?
So I think that might be the reason why Nigeria is excluded. But I do. But
we have Coke in Nigeria. We have Pepsi.
Right. I do agree that there is a sense in which the Puma ad it's a sort of francophone, although Ghana seems to play into it a little bit. But there is some argument to be made for that.
It's also the absence of having a very big Nigerian star right now,
right,
on the level of SCN or Drogba, really.
Mikel, as you said, but other than that, there isn't. The others are quite old now.
Yeah. Rival German footwear companies. It used to be colonial powers. Now it's just corporations.
Now it's just footwear corporations.
Yeah, they were brothers. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you absolutely about the essentialism thing, and I think for me this whole thing is and football always is a matter of it's a terrain that's contested, and there's a lot of different things going on, a lot of different meanings that are being attached, and a lot of the packaging of the World Cup is going to be this utterly bogus kind of representation of an Africa that's frozen. I mean, I couldn't believe that the South African Tourism Board used rhythm. We've got rhythm. It was such a cliche, but there you go. So yes, that is going to be in play, but there are going to be a whole lot of other narratives in play, and I think it's quite a challenging. Thing. You mentioned the Swiss, and I mean it's a brilliant example. Mm-hmm. Switzerland's immigration politics are so right-wing, and yet their football team basically it's an Ivorian and
there's a Ghanaian,
Turk,
Croatian,
Cabo Verdean. There's the whole of the former Yugoslavia. Yeah. It's but then again, you think, well, in many ways, football is so much was so often cast as a sort of contest of national identities. And when England plays Argentina, the battle lines are absolutely clear. For the Argentinians, there's no question this is the Malvinas War all over again, and England has to be ritually humiliated for the real, flesh and blood humiliation that the Argentinians suffered in 1982. And yet, increasingly because of what's happening to the nation state, I guess, is the nation state becoming more and more diverse, less and less important, and identities within it are more and more fluid. So, I mean, there's sort of, in some ways, you can look at the Spanish, maybe more of it's a more archaic example where, this is a Spanish team and it's all about Spanish identity, but
it's not.
Yeah, but it's not. I mean, for the Catalans, the first identity they express on the football field for a lot of those players, for Xavi, Iniesta, Xavi, Pepe Reina, Puyol, there's more. There are more. They're Catalan, and for the Basques, they're great. It always struck me as ironic that Real Sociedad back in the day got John Toshak to be their manager because John Toshak was Welsh. And the Welsh have this bizarre recognition by FIFA as a country. And they have their own national football team. And
the Basques do not.
No, not the Basques.
But the Basques don't. The Basques get to play the occasional friendly. And so there's real pain. I mean, a Spanish friend of mine told me once he was going to the Spanish Cup final. It was Real Sociedad versus, Barcelona or Real Madrid at the time, and in the warm-up game was Spain's under-17s versus Yugoslavia's under-17s, and the Basque fans were all cheering Yugoslavia because they could not, support Spain. So, you have these little narratives. I mean, I'll never forget, you know all about the Basques, you know about the Catalans. Euro 2008, Spain triumphs. Next thing, they're all cheering up on the platform. Sergio Ramos rips off his shirt. And he's wearing a green and white flag. And you're like, what? Andalusia. It's like, why should Andalusia be left out of the conversation? So, I mean, you have, for a lot of these countries, the national is very fluid and contested. I mean, France, look at France in 1998, where you have, on the one hand, Le Pen coming along and saying, this is not a real French team. Mm-hmm. And of course not, because most of them are either first-generation immigrants from Africa themselves or the children of immigrants. So in the Front National schema, these are not real French people, but France is happy to embrace them, at least on the football field, but if not, in perhaps the political space. And, Zinedine Zidane is the national hero, is the epitome of French manhood and all of these things, and, until the last World Cup, and they're not really sure what to make of him. But it's interesting when Zidane talks about his own identity. There's that famous interview in which he said, if you want to understand who I am, you have to know first I'm a Kabyle from Le Castellan. It's a Berber neighborhood in Marseille. Second, I'm an Algerian from Marseille. And third, I'm a Frenchman. And, Zidane's going to the World Cup as a coach now for the Algerian team. But Zidane's relationship with his Algerianness is no simpler than his relationship with his Frenchness, because he's a Berber. Yeah. And they're a minority, an oppressed minority, and so on. So, I think that
Zidane's mother said quite recently, some things are bigger than football, such as a man's honor.
Right, but because wasn't it amazing?
So Zidane never apologized to Materazzi for that headbutt. He apologized to his own teammates and to France, but never to Materazzi. And he said he will never, ever apologize, and he will not say what the offense is. But clearly his mother knows what the offense is.
But can I ask, who around this room saw that happen and didn't assume that the meaning of that incident was something that Frantz Fanon had written about, 40 years earlier?
No, it was...
I mean, in that moment, you were like, I don't know, I cheered. I was like,
cheered.
Kick him, jump.
Actually, the interesting thing right after it was to see young men around, like, some parts of Brooklyn wearing French jerseys in the day after the final.
Right.
Suddenly,
celebrating
celebrating
it was a kind of triumph.
The headbutt, yeah. Right. But I wanted to bring the audience into it. So I have one other, it's not a big question, but the world, we are in the United States, right? And there's always the long argument about, is the U.S., in terms of sort of U.S. soccer identity or football identity, whether the U.S., can become a soccer nation, right? And I mean, maybe a couple of years ago, you could have been dismissive about that, but we were just chatting before. ESPN is pouring a lot of money into it. There's a thing here called Fox Soccer Channel, which I religiously watch, including games that are being replayed. It's overtly too English. I mean, we can debate that it's so much about showing you matches from the football championship and the playoffs for the third division. But other than that, I mean, it is clear that there is now sort of a critical mass for football in this country, and the U.S. is going to the World Cup, and it has a good team. Landon Donovan, like players who won the Gold Cup, etc. So on. So Clint Dempsey, for Fulham still, right? Or James, still Fulham. Yeah. So I mean, how do we think? What does this World Cup mean for America? And also some of us are immigrants here. We have children here now, and my kids are wearing South Africa strip, by the way. But at some other point, they probably will also support the United States. So what is this kind of schizophrenia about America and football not just America, the authorities, the sport, the TV stations, etc. The commerce, but also us as supporters and.
Do you remember 2000? And it was in Korea, Japan, right?
2002.
2002. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And what that meant for those of us in this country was some funny hours, right? Those of you who watched it, you had to get up really, really early. You find a place that's playing it because you don't want to watch it at home. So you're standing outside a restaurant somewhere out in Queens at like 6 a.m. Like, are you guys open or not? Are we going to watch this thing? Well, so there was this sense of a tribe of us that were doing this. Our president is Obama now. and in a very profound way, whatever his interest in football is, and I think he's a little bit interested, he's actually part of that tribe of Americans who've really got one foot in another world. And there are very, very many of us. So when you talk about American interests in the World Cup, a very substantial part of it is that there are many of us who are not thought of as being in the mainstream of America. But we're here, and we're here in very large numbers, and it matters very, very profoundly to us. And there's no place where you're going to see that more than in New York City, where in every single immigrant enclave in this city, the World Cup is significant, and it's being shown, and people are gathering and celebrating, as I experienced with my brother over there, a true football head. In the last World Cup, we watched about 50 matches, watched them live on TV, in probably about 50 different locations around the city. I mean, fine, we didn't earn any money that month, but you know what? So, and that's an experience that where you don't feel as if you're in, you know, the U.S. of the cliche where nobody cares about the World Cup, because these people cared, from Newark to Queens to people, strangers' homes in the Bronx, all over Brooklyn, Manhattan, everywhere. I mean, we pounded pavement that month, and we're going to do it again.
I think one of the things that especially a company like ESPN is hoping for is that you start with the idea that none of us follow swim meets unless Michael Phelps is swimming and it's the Olympics. So why can't you get into some soccer every 4 years when it's the World Cup? I mean, you're right, there are plenty of people who are very passionate about it, especially in this area. But I've heard a lot of these, you know, well, when is it going to catch on in the U.S. and so forth? And I just don't think it's, you know, it's not one of those things that you can force. It's just going to have to happen on its own. There's more excitement around it this year than there has been in the past because of where it's located. And I think this idea that if you can get excited about Michael Phelps and the butterfly every 4 years, then you can get excited about this tournament.
But don't have Dave O'Brien calling the games.
Yeah,
for heaven's
it's not
sake.
my call.
I mean, just watch it in Spanish. Really, trust me.
You know, the other thing,
just go for it.
The other thing that's impossible for people to understand, I think, is the way that what this means to most people around the world. At the end of the Euro Cup in '04, I had been in Greece on a trip. I happened to get back the day before the final. At the time, I was living in Astoria, you know, the heart of the Greek neighborhood.
I was there for that final too, in Astoria.
In Astoria. Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe you were there, maybe you were around the corner.
Yeah.
The day of the final, all of the Greek shops and cafes and restaurants pulled their televisions out and set them on the street corners and on the sidewalks, and it was this wonderful sort of outdoor all day long party. And at the end of the game, I was outside a place, I think it's Lefkos Pyrgos or something like that. It's right below the elevated tracks of the NW. And at the end of the game, thousands of people flooded into the streets and blocked off traffic, and it was this huge party, and before long, the NYPD showed up. And they didn't know quite what to do, because this was this festive occasion, but they were a little bit worried that it might get out of control and what's going to happen. And so they sort of surrounded the area and kind of weren't sure how to handle the rising noise. When at the back of the crowd, an old man who I think was the high priest of the local Greek Orthodox Church, dressed from head to toe in black with his long white beard and moving very slowly, was being led through the crowd to the heart of this massive group of people at the intersection below the elevated tracks. And the police embraced this movement because they felt like, well, a religious leader from the neighborhood, if anyone is going to calm this situation down and make it all okay, it might be this old, quiet man. So he was led very slowly, and sure enough, the crowd got deadly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. And they brought him to the center of the crowd, and they got him up onto a stool so that everyone could see him, and everyone waited for what this man was going to say to sort of tell everyone to go home. And he reached below his black robe and pulled out an air horn and went wah, 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 and everyone went crazy. And the police were flummoxed. So it's that kind of thing just doesn't, there isn't a sort of an American equivalent of that, I don't think. So.
I mean, there's no grudge war. I mean, in a sense, everybody's in it somehow because you have some beef. I mean, really do have beef. I mean, even me, I'm a Kenyan. You're like, I have beef with France and because of Senegal. So I'm a Senegalese citizen somehow. And it's funny because somehow, for whatever reasons that there are, maybe it's ice hockey with Russia, I don't know what it is. It's very difficult to imagine in a singular way, like what beef America's playing out on a pitch somehow. Yeah. That's intricate because it's also beef that has relationships, you know? It's kind of the beef of brothers who fell out somehow, and then you're playing for so-and-so. Sorry.
No, I think it's a very interesting point, but don't you notice that often it's usually the country that lost the war that has the beef on the football field, and the country that won the war is kind of oblivious. It's like the US plays Iran in 1998, and you know the US. It's a game of football.
When's
you know,
the
it's
last
like
war we
ASO.
won?
We've been doing this in Long Island since
What's the last war we won?
That's right. I forget.
No, exactly. Well, yeah, but I mean, the great thing about football for Americans, I think, is that you're not the hegemon. You know, you're on a play. It's a guilt-free moment to kind of go USA, 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 because it's not the country with the aircraft carriers and the 232 nukes that Hillary mentioned yesterday. You know, I mean, I'm not, you know, I mean, I think there's something fantastic
true,
about
but
US
there are
soccer.
all these unseen significances elsewhere.
Yes.
Because you're having countries seemingly randomly put together, and then you realize that, you know, there's a story. Nobody forgets France versus Senegal.
Right.
Which is, you know.
Well, the French probably do.
I mean,
the French might not actually.
If you were not rooting for Senegal that day, you know, there's something wrong
Right.
with you, you know.
Yeah.
Even the French were rooting for Senegal, you know.
Yeah.
So it's highly significant, or when, you know, like you said, Argentina, England,
Well, England, USA,
Germany, Holland, that is huge.
The first match.
Angola, Portugal,
Yeah.
which we watched in an Angolan/Portuguese neighborhood. I mean, that was extreme. I mean, these are very, very meaningful things for people.
Right.
Trinidad versus England in the last World Cup.
Peter Crouch.
I mean, for the English, maybe it's just a match. For the people from Trinidad and Tobago,
Absolutely.
this becomes, you know, and the heartbreak out in what neighborhood was it? Flatbush. It was way out in Flatbush. I mean, the only thing that was
The English
missing
cheated.
from a perfect afternoon was a victory on the pitch. But otherwise, you know, the food and the drink and the dancing and just the joy in the occasion.
I always wondered, I wish CLR James was alive to comment on the fact that England's breakthrough goal happens because Peter Crouch literally grabs the dreadlocks of the Trinidadian defender to hoist himself aloft. I mean, that was just, it was in a nutshell, the whole history of British
too far
Empire.
off for the ref to see it.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, we have a lot of hands, I think, of people who want to ask questions or comment. So should we just take one at a time, or should we take three at a time? Like, or should we, one at a time? Okay.
I just have a question. I mean, one of the matters you sort of haven't mentioned really is, I find one of the problems, not really, it's just an issue, is how much money is being spent in South Africa and how much poverty there is. So, and that's not really being addressed so much in the media also. So you've got a huge stadium, which you're saying nobody's going to play at because there's not really much playing going on, which to me I find very sad because there should be soccer everywhere. So there should be more playing locally, not just following English teams. There should be, you know, African teams that locals follow, you know, there should be teams there. And what happens to that huge stadium, all that money, where does it go?
I just want to repeat the question for the recording. This is a question about the huge stadiums being built in South Africa and, you know, what sort of the economic implications of the World Cup and who plays in them.
And you have a lot of people coming in, a lot of money being spent, does it go to people who actually...
Can the locals afford to go and play there, and will people play in these stadiums afterwards? Like spending all this money on these, you know, colossal stadiums. Any comment on that?
Well, I know that's a subject you've thought about, so maybe you should answer.
I am acting as the what's it, objective chair? Yeah. I mean, okay. Just quickly on that, I have 2 points to make on that. Of course, I'm a little upset that you can spend, you know, so much money on building like football stadiums, or that locals may not be able to afford to go to some of the matches. A couple of things on that though. They are making tickets available to construction workers who work on the stadiums. There's a two-tiered ticketing system, so locals pay less than international visitors. And what was the other argument I was going to make? Oh, the other thing I was going to make, I think a lot of those arguments around the stadiums are also unreasonable towards the World Cup. And it's not that I'm disrespecting your opinion. What I mean by this is the World Cup has been played in like horrible times and in horrible places before, and no one like made like a stink or whatever. I'll give you an example. In 1978, and I know there are Argentinians here, but the World Cup was played in Argentina while there was a dictatorship. And people were getting murdered next door, in the stadium next door. So it's like the politics of like where the World Cup is played was never an issue, I think, until this particular World Cup. That's the first one. The second one, I think, is it's unreasonable to expect that the World Cup will be sort of developmental. If there wasn't going to be stadiums, I don't think there would be that kind of money, that the South African government would be spending that kind of money on housing or, do you know what I'm saying, on social services. I don't think it was going to happen anyway. And I think a final thing is there are people saying that they will protest during the World Cup, and I think their reasons are probably sound, but I think it's going to be politically, I don't think it's the smartest move because South Africans are waiting for this thing. Ordinary, poor, black South Africans want to be part of the World Cup. They may not be happy with their government and the government's performance, but of course they're going to celebrate this. I think I'm not sure if I answered that in a straight way, but I think it's a sort of difficult, I'm concerned about all the money being spent on it and whether those stadiums, when it's over, nobody's going to play there anymore. There are like plans to move, like rugby, where people can afford to go to these big stadiums, are going to take over some of the stadiums. I know in Cape Town that's going to become the new home of the rugby team. So the stadium's going to be used. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Looking so much, what you sort of heard is, they're kind of going to be emptied afterwards. No one's going to use them. And that seems like that's a lot of money for a stadium if no one's going to use it again.
There are all those things, and I think they come in some way even with the other World Cups, like will it for London? But I feel for me the point is just soccer means something big to nearly 1 billion people in Africa. It's substantial. You spend a part of your day watching it. That's enough. Like without the cost, the stadium, anything, that's enough. It's part of my life. I'm happy it's there. So in the context that, yes, I'm sure that there, and fortunately, South Africa is full of people who will be standing outside with clipboards, counting each frog and each poor person, and I'm happy that that's the case. But the case needs to be made that there's never been a World Cup in Africa, and Africa is fanatical about soccer, and we love it. And so, and that for me that's a very important thing. Not the idea of it as just a game or as a commodity or anything else. That it matters, that we are following, that we're consumers, that it will matter, and not because I keep hearing even the politicians saying, but when we calculate the foreign investment, whatever, it's football. Yes, also, but it's football. It's our Super Bowl. We want it.
Yeah, and just to follow the point that you both made, one of the most underreported stories from the last Olympics was just the joy and pleasure that ordinary Chinese people took in the fact that it was in their own country. And I more or less boycotted the Olympics for my own confused political reasons. But the fact is, the ordinary person in China, for the most part, was really happy this thing was there because it also gave them an opportunity to be on the world stage. But to go to your comment about this notion that maybe people in South Africa should be supporting or watching local leagues rather than the English Premiership, I don't think there should be compulsion in matters of love, If
there were more encouraging local teams as well. And for girls, I know there have been coaches now who
Well, there are local leagues that are going on, and there's local leagues in almost every country. But the fact of the matter is that the important thing is that people are free to choose, and people choose to follow the most exciting leagues with the most skilled players, and to have it beamed into their homes in high definition, even if the home itself is a shack. And that's one of those small pleasures that people really have.
Just quickly on the South African local football, there are some exciting teams in that league, probably like 2 or 3 really good teams. But like most leagues, unlike the English league, even like the Spanish league, etc., most of those leagues also are kind of revolve around 3 or 4 good teams, and then the rest are kind of, not very good. The South African league is the same. The other problem with the South African local league is that it's badly organized. I mean, as an experience, when I'm in South Africa, I make a point of finding out, if there's local matches going on, and I try to go to them. But the service, like the comfort, like going to a match, it doesn't live up to it. So I think there's also, maybe the World Cup might teach the local league something about organization and about, thinking about fans. Because of course, South Africa is going to put on a good show, because it's outsiders coming. We have to put on a good show. So I think that's part of it. But I want more questions. So I've got a question there, and maybe I should take 2 questions at this point. And so at the back, and then I'll take a question from Bronwyn.
I really want to believe that football and sport can be this uplifting force for Africa and for the individual countries. I'd like to first just ask the panelists from Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria I won't make the mistake of defining what Africa needs, but I'd like to ask them to think about what their countries need and then try to make the bridge between, can this excitement and fervor and passion actually translate into local community development?
Okay, and then we have a second question over here, and then we'll have a...
I was just wondering about, 2 years ago, South Africa, we had quite a serious spate of xenophobic attacks that took place. And at that time, I was in South Africa, largely ashamed to be South African, in the spirit of what had happened. Many Africans, neighboring countries, who had been in South Africa for 30 years, were forcibly moved out of South Africa. I'm not sure that we've recovered from that. I'm not sure that we've dealt with it. And watching this kind of spirit of the adverts and this kind of culture that's being pushed through global brands, I'm just wondering how, if you know of any other media that's happening, that's fostering greater integration through the soccer. I'm wondering about people who are not going to fly into South Africa, who's going to come through trains and buses from neighboring countries. How will they be welcomed into South Africa? I'm just wondering if you know any of that. I don't know, but I just think it's quite an important area.
So we'll answer those, and then after that I have 2 more questions here. Any takers for those questions?
I don't know. I can't claim sort of much knowledge on the xenophobia thing. The one thing I'd be a little bit worried about is that there is actually a xenophobic echo in a lot of South African soccer fans who, because the national team in South Africa is very weak, and it's a product of the things that Sean was talking about, and that actually you're raising, that there's not a very good grassroots organized football culture, except in one minority culture in South Africa. Where I don't know how familiar people are with the sort of ethnic terms, but colored in South Africa is, it's 3 million people, but it's more than half of the national football team, because it's the only community that's really had an organized grassroots national football team that was part of the struggle in the old days. It was, but really organic, that 6-year-olds, Benny McCarthy, people, Benny McCarthy, Stephen Pienaar, these guys who are global stars now, started off being trained in a struggle football situation when they were very young. Because the national team, because of a lack of investment and political will, I think, that hasn't been replicated in Soweto, hasn't been replicated in the big townships, and you have a very weak player pool now. You can always tell how strong a country is relatively in football terms, like it or not, by the number of players playing in Europe. And in South Africa, that's a very low number. And what you have when the national conversation starts, people start saying, no, the problem is there are too many foreigners in the South African league. There are too many Zimbabweans and Zambians and Nigerians and so on. And so it's actually an echo of what you're raising, which is very, very unfortunate. It's misdirecting. It resonates with a very violent and ugly phenomenon, but it also sort of, just misunderstanding the priorities. But I'm sure there are more uplifting things to say than that.
To think of the way that both of your questions connect, my answer to your question as far as Nigeria and the World Cup is concerned and socio-economic change, there's no connection, zero. The World Cup is not going to mean anything to Nigerians in Nigeria beyond if we get to the semifinal or we win the thing. And I mean, if we win the World Cup, I'll be grilling and eating my hat with pepper sauce. But this question of enthusiasm, I mean, to go with something that Binyavanga said very early on, he's a writer, he looks for problems. For me, the World Cup is also a zone of melancholy and a certain, for me, there's an emotional hesitation that's there, specifically this one, precisely because of the euphoria that is preceding it. Because I've observed the media long enough to know that euphoria usually tends to precede, the most aggressive forms of condemnation and criticism.
Let down.
Let down. They're willing themselves to be let down by it. So there's this amazing African event, right? And now we're all sort of on tenterhooks waiting for the one incident, the two incidents that will switch the narrative around completely. Now, we don't know who got shot or mugged in Cape Town yesterday or in Johannesburg last week. We really don't care probably because of their color and their official affiliation. But we will care in the middle of June about who that person is, depending on their color and their official affiliation. And this is sort of like in a way, it's really unfair, but it's a disaster that's waiting to happen that way. So I think this is the shadow side of that enthusiasm. It's still that same problem of essentialism. Whatever happens at the World Cup becomes a way of saying something about Africa, regardless of how meaningless or foolish it is. So that's very much on my mind.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. I mean, I as far as ground center development and so on and so forth, I don't know. I know that these days that everybody doing a project has to explain something about what it does to the grassroots, and then they have to say what it does to the environment, and it does do a lot of things like that. And I have just never even begun to think about, it's just football, it's we play the ball, so on and so forth. The World Cup said there are going to be issues, and it's going to be great, it's going to be horrible, and we are nervous, and then could it be like Angola? That's really where things are. I mean, there are many subject matters now to think about, talking about development, the fall of the markets, oil, I don't know, many. This one maybe is not a good idea, but it's going to be a ride. But on the xenophobia idea, I think that I haven't followed so much what's been going on. I haven't seen any coverage about that idea. In fact, it's disturbing when you mention the idea of people coming with buses, because it just kind of feel like those are the things that often don't get covered. I know that there are humongous number. There's been these rolling clubs of people in Kenya who are or even a bank savings plan for people who are gathering up convoys of cars to drive down. And I knew that someone was telling me there's something like 10,000 people. And it's not even getting to the stadium, it's going. So one of the things that happens, of course, which is interesting, is that in cities, in Nairobi, the Congolese were always invisible somehow. You end up meeting each other in odd and awkward ways in Brooklyn and and in South Africa too. I think more than any single thing, you're going to see a really visible presence of people. And there are certain ways that things get disarmed, in the sense that people just naturally go to look for Senegalese people when Senegal is playing, or Senegal is in there, or Cote d'Ivoire is playing, and you find yourself there. Those become important things because, in a funny way, South Africa really hasn't had one large institutional thing that's introduced South Africa to the continent. The continent was involved in very personal ways with the inauguration. We were watching it. But I can't actually remember any single event that South Africa was watching that the continent was present in that wasn't so much home. So, I think that then the question about hosting, that these people are here and the world is here, becomes something. What that something is, I don't know. Will there be xenophobic attacks? Probably. So that's my thought about it. But I think it's been a long time since we've had just something good to be happy about. And if it's just people kicking a ball and then you go, that works for me.
I have two questions. I've noted a question at the back, but they're over there. But I got these two questions for now.
It's a bit of a stereotype, and I was thinking of passing on, not asking the question, because the woman sitting at the end of the table asking, "What about the girls?" Right? FIFA is doing all this to promote girls' soccer among schoolgirls in South Africa, but soccer among women in South Africa has got a long history of being associated with queer politics. So a lot of women's soccer teams, social soccer teams, are predominantly lesbian women, and that's recognized. And so female soccer players in South Africa get attacked. And a few years ago, right around about the time of the World Cup will be coming to an end, actually, for the anniversary of the death of one of South Africa's leading female soccer players, a lesbian, Yudi Similani, who was murdered for being a lesbian, being an activist. So one of the concerns that I have is FIFA is going in, promoting soccer in schools for girls in South Africa, and got all this fervor around what we're going to do with soccer to make it a better place for South African people, and then they're going to leave. And we're going to have a bunch of women who are still being targeted as lesbians because there is no structure in place here to change the gender dynamics that's inherent in this massive event. Right? So it's kind of a very broad question or sort of observation, which I would just like to put out there.
And then we have one other question. Yeah.
I'm so humbled by the quality of the questions that precede me. I apologize for one that will seem much more parochial. And then I just quickly have an anecdote about Drogba. Simply, in this, my question is prompted by some of the introductory remarks about whether or not how to think of this as Africa as hosting the World Cup, Africa as a country. Whether any of you would care to address whether the reception and anticipation of the World Cup has been different in Saharan and what we'll describe as Saharan and Sub-Saharan Africa. The remark you made earlier about how it is the World Cup that is kind of holding together the nation of Nigeria. I've thought had some reflection on that as well. The anecdote very quickly is less than a year ago. I was taking a cab home because of the size of my party. I was in the front seat with the driver. We were speaking, asked him his formation. He said, Cote d'Ivoire. I said, oh, Didier Drogba. He screamed. Pulled the car over to the side.
Excellent.
How do you know? How do you know? Yeah. And Girls Home refused to take the fare.
Oh, wow.
Well played. Any comments on that? Or?
Well, I wonder if Tony knows what the, or maybe also knows, what is this, what's the story between Algeria and Egypt?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, asking about the Saharan aspect of it, the World Cup may be what's keeping Nigeria together, but it's what nearly
caused a war.
Sent Egypt and Algeria to war, yeah. It was quite nasty there in was it January, I think?
It was in November.
It was the end of last year.
The end of last year.
Yeah, the qualifying. I really, looking for kind of football wars always really struggle to try and find, for people, what he's referring to is the fact that there was a sort of week of protest and mutual protest, withdrawal of ambassadors, some street violence and so on, when Egypt lost to Algeria over 2 legs to Algeria qualified. And the best explanations I've seen from people about that were more about the domestic situation politically in Egypt and how the regime sort of, and perhaps Algeria also, but the regime sits so, so the authoritarian regime is so sort of much in control of so much, and there's so little political space for expression that a lot of passion gets sort of sublimated. I think this happens, I've read this about Tunisia as well, that soccer becomes a channel for outlet of
outlet.
these things. And so, when the nation is being sort of slighted somehow, they have had a history, though. They've had very violent, I think in 1998, very violent on-field. There was a game in which the Algerian fans attacked Egyptian players. The Egyptian team doctor lost his eye. So there's obviously a lot of passion. I can't peg it to a geopolitical.
Well, and then I was at the game. The grudge match was in Angola. I think it was the semifinals, the Egypt-Algeria grudge match from the World Cup. And it was in Benguela in Angola, and I was at that game, and it was very intense. And after the game, I mean, Algeria lost. Egypt beat them
4-0 or something?
handily. It was a very easy win for Egypt, but it nearly got quite violent after the match was over. So,
but apropos your question about Saharan and Sub-Saharan, I think also it really goes to that point about what Africa as a thing, relationship, a country. I mean, those countries around the Mediterranean basin probably have more in common with the people with whom they share an ocean than people with whom they share this continental
Except that they do
landmass.
play in the African Nations Cup, and so we sort of grew up with a sense that they're part of the African nations. I remember from when I was a toddler watching Algeria play well. Exactly right, Belloumi and all these guys. But I don't think you're going to get a Nigerian who's going to say, well, we got knocked out, but at least Algeria won. I just don't think the identification goes that far. I mean, in the last World Cup, we all supported Ghana because we didn't get that far, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, but we won't support them now because we're in it. But I don't think the identification, and I'm not sure if they also identify with people in Sub-Saharan Africa in that way, like they would rather us win than Brazil or Spain or something like that. But I want to make sure we answer this lady's question also. I don't think it's just an African problem. This morning I was thinking about the World Cup and I thought, well, you know what? This is male privilege. Why don't you just call it Male History Month? Really, because, but you don't think about it. The question doesn't come up that it is. Of men, by men, for men and women, but mostly it's the question of the female role really does not come up. Not in Africa, not anywhere else, really. Absolutely not anywhere else. The U.S. was probably the best chance of that happening, and it didn't happen. The sports bra, yes.
The sports bra thing. I was gonna say that,
But I mean, it's significant that it's only in this sort of vaguely sexualized form that an iconic image was deposited in the hive mind.
I mean, you're talking about two things: the stigma around just women's soccer, and then women's soccer as sort of queer, as gay, and then there's that stigma in which gay becomes a stigma. I mean, I agree with you. There is that. That's part of this. That's in the background, and no one's talking about it. And you're right that in the there has to be public education in South Africa around. Look, women play football, and they just play, and that's it. But there isn't. I don't think there is enough. And just quickly, I just saw a website, and they doing all kinds of interesting things with the web. They trying to deal with both the stigma of women in football and
But you know what? South Africa at least has a queer Supreme Court justice, right? Which the U.S. doesn't have yet.
I think,
but here's our chance.
I think that it's worth. I mean, I don't really have anything to offer on the question you asked, except that it prompts me the fact that in terms of the question of queer politics, actually the male game is remarkably silent on that as well. The only instance I can think of is Justin Fashanu, right? The former Nigerian British guy who played for England. It's probably one of the very few, and Matthew Letizia actually was an England fullback, but very few.
Letizia came out as.
No, not Letizia. Graham Lasso. No.
It's a fullback. Oh, let's not say things on camera.
Okay, we may have to edit there. But,
edit that part.
No, but I think it's remarkable that actually, just given the percentages and kind of what are the chances that it's really a space in which even as cosmopolitan and liberal and, the anti-racism thing is really, it's contested, but it's very much taken forward. There's really still no space for footballers to come out of the closet.
I've got two. I've got Olejeho and the gentleman here, and then I've noted these for the next round. Okay, so those two.
Well, I can't go a little bit later, so we will discuss stop this exciting opinions and program. I'd like to ask you, this kind of conflict between this national identity and transnational identity of the World Cup. World Cup is just a naked anti-nationalism, and it's based on whole is a global multimedia, media network, and such a big TV net revenue. One thing is that there's a kind of issue of the global citizenship through World Cup, as you just mentioned about it. But it's like Nigeria, the case is just revealed is that there's a big, strong nationalism actually utilizing this whole World Cup qualification as well. We don't change the team. I can't accept the efforts, right? Once you are in, it's Liverpool. And the American context we just mentioned a little bit earlier. Here is a club is called as a franchise, which means you can change the cities. Right? You can go, Brooklyn Dodgers can go to this LA, right? Los Angeles. But you can change your job nationality, but in European context, you can't change the team. Right? So
club.
You can't change it.
You mean you can't change the city?
Yeah, you can't change. You can't move the team from Liverpool to London.
No. No, but you can change your nationality.
Yeah, you can change it.
No, the player can change. I mean, literally, FIFA allows you to choose your nationality. No, the player. The player, you can play under 21 for Nigeria and play at a senior level for England. You're only allowed to change once, but you qualify for a senior team. But apropos the nation, we did touch on this a little earlier, but the nation is a very fungible and fluid notion in FIFA. You'll see when the Ivoirians play, Solomon Kalou, and when he plays for Chelsea now, he wears the Cote d'Ivoire flag on his wristband, like Drogba. But basically, if Holland hadn't had a very conservative interior minister before the 2006 World Cup, he would be Dutch. He would still be in orange, but the other orange. The Dutch tried to give him a citizenship, and they had this conservative interior minister who said no. So he joined his brother, who was playing for Cote d'Ivoire, on the national team. So it's, I think, in some ways, also the question of club versus country is getting more and more interesting, because the clubs are where the money is, the clubs are where the power is, the clubs are where all the best players in the world play every week now. So in some ways, all of the Brazilians, all of the Ivoirians, all of the Americans, probably most of them, will be playing from in European clubs. And at some point, those clubs where the money is start thinking, wait, we've invested all this money in these players, they're an asset of ours. They put themselves at risk when they play for the national team. Do they really need to play that friendly?
The African Cup of Nations.
The African Cup of Nations. All the European teams. I mean, this is their huge complaint, and I suspect they'll actually move the African Cup of Nations eventually into the European summer months, because so many of the players are playing in Europe. But there's that real contest now. The clubs, it's corporations versus nation states, basically.
Can I have the question in the back? We'll take that question. I'll also take the gentleman next to you. Yeah.
It's more of a comment, not a question. I think 3 positives and 1 negative when you look at the World Cup. Remove the game and just look at it as a metaphor or phenomenon. I spent all my time in Africa working in education and health development and some economic development. And I think from if you analogize FIFA to the Vatican, you wouldn't be surprised that the World Cup is in South Africa. Really. I mean, just like don't be surprised when the majority of Cardinals become Latin American. That, as you said, the audience is there, the market is there, and FIFA is totally hip to that fact. So more and more you're going to see, I think, that connection. In terms of positive, this nation state thing, I think the pride of place and self connected to these teams and the connection, I think, has been super, super positive. And whether that's a psychic positive and translate to something else, who knows, but it's certainly a huge psychic positive. To the woman's question about South Africa and the benefit of the World Cup in terms of, the people on the ground, I just spent a couple of weeks with the Department of Health in Pretoria, and I guarantee, and it's been a 2-year project, I guarantee you that this national rollout that has just been publicized last week would not happen this April, May, going through the summer if the World Cup was in South Africa. The denialism and the legacy factor and taking the time to finally deal with a ramp up of testing and treatment of HIV would not have happened. The political pressure, the world focus, making it sort of like we did it on our own, definitely happened. So that's a huge benefit. About the women's issue, the real negative, huge negative that nobody's talking about that's really scary vis-a-vis the World Cup is in all of our refugee camps anywhere that borders South Africa now for the last 18 months. There's been a huge ramp up in young girls just disappearing. And the sex trafficking business is highly organized and highly motivated, and all of the times that there is an interdiction, you're finding huge smuggling operations of bringing sex workers in voluntarily and involuntarily into South Africa. So that's obviously the dark side of it, but I think there's some huge developmental sides, positive sides as well.
On the gentleman.
And I guess I was just going to piggyback on this a little bit. I guess one of the things for me that never really get talked about is the role of FIFA and the responsibility that FIFA has. And rightly so, like you said, compared to Latin, they have a lot of power. When you talk about girls soccer, the head of FIFA made a comment a couple of years ago about women possibly wearing more sort of safe clothing. That doesn't really help the situation. If you talk about stadium developments in South Africa, I think the lady brings up a great point, because you look at Greece with regards to the Olympics that just occurred and look at the financial circumstances that they're in now. You can't really predict those things going forward, but at what cost is it beneficial? Obviously, there are other tangential issues where it is a money's benefit, but there are greater questions to be asked of FIFA with regards to what their responsibility is with regards to the game and how they go about it.
Those are two comments, kind of questions. So maybe who else had their hand up?
Yes, thank you very much for your comments. I mean, one of the more shocking things to me, and I think a lot of this has to do with representation and how Africa is being represented and what have you. And at the draw, I mean, you had this amazing spokeswoman presenting Zumas on stage. Hopefully everyone knows what the politics of Zuma are. And then the head of FIFA saying, hopefully everyone can see, pointing to the woman, the benefits that South Africa has to offer. And it was just this really incredibly blatant moment of come and enjoy more than,
Football.
Yeah.
Did Zuma applaud?
He was, he smiled. He's got the diplomacy down now. So I do think it's pretty, it goes hand in hand, and I don't,
Do I have any other? I think this might. Who's going to have the last word in terms of questions from the floor?
I have a question.
Oh, you have a question? Okay.
Okay. You're on the record. Who's winning this damn thing?
Oh yeah, this is a good question. This is actually a very good question, and this will actually close everything down.
Money, quite literally, $20 in London, where you can bet on these things, is on Côte d'Ivoire, which is also where my heart is. If I was playing it safe, I might have said Brazil or Spain. I could go. I could tell you each goodbye.
I hope you're right about the Côte d'Ivoire thing, but I fear it's not true. My worry is that, based on what happened with the Inter Milan-Barcelona game recently, my worry is that Italy is going to be strong again, and they're going to do this lockdown defense thing, and it's going to destroy the pretty football that we might see elsewhere, and I worry that Italy will defend.
You had your chance. You had your chance. You had your chance. You had your chance. There's some alcohol afterwards. Okay, don't edit that out also.
If I was looking for the best return for my money, people underrate the U.S.
Oh, come on. He's trying to win favor.
Is this thing on?
I didn't say I love the team, but that's
on YouTube. He's on YouTube. He's on YouTube. He's gonna get hit. He's gonna get hit.
I have my ID right here. Don't deport me.
I want betting tips. I want predictions. Even though the odds are the same for everybody. Who you got?
Good teams.
Brazil.
No, I can't come in. I can't come in. There are too many injuries. There's too many weird things going on. Yeah.
Based on Brazil, just form, Confederations Cup, Copa America, Brazil. Definitely Brazil. And also because of the long history of when you're in the third world and your team can't win, you support Brazil.
That's the safest investment of money there could be in the World Cup.
That's true, and they play more like Italy now, so they play well, they play safe.
They have 2 sides, 3 sides, 7 sides.
They've got some center backs.
Binyavanga has the last word.
Heart Brazil, money, heart Ivory Coast, Ghana, money Brazil.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much for coming.